Okay, so you should have been able to do that. It's not a very difficult graph. I don't want you, by the way, just to look it up in necessarily in the book unless you really have difficulty with it. You should have it in your head already. You should find graphs related to supernormal profits or normal profits to be pretty easy. This is an example of where when you're giving me answers to essays, that very gracefully and very smoothly you introduce graphs into your answer. That there is no question on the exam saying, please draw for me a supernormal or normal profit graph. There isn't. But the moment you start talking about, market failures, this is going to lead on to an argument about monopolies. This gives you the opportunity to draw a graph about a monopoly, which leads to the possibility of drawing a graph about a supernormal profit or a normal profit. All of this is giving you an opportunity to boost your mark. I can't say it enough that you have to get out of your mind this idea of minimizing your answer, giving me, 3 sentences and that's your answer for an essay. You have to develop your ideas. And while you're developing your answer, you should be very naturally moving into graphic illustrations to what you're trying to say. Okay? So, this should help you to explain to us why a monopoly is an example of market failure. Okay, just the fact that the price is so much greater in a monopoly than in a competitive industry should be enough of an answer, but certainly develop it even further by discussing supernormal profits and normal profits. Okay, we also talked yesterday about public goods, and we were saying how it's really important that you explain why it is that private companies just don't bother. They don't bother to deal with public goods. It's just not in their business, and I don't actually criticize them. I mean, why should you expect them to play a game of trying to provide services for society when that's not their raison d'être, as we say in French, reason to be. It's not their reason to be. It's not their, what they do. I mean, a private firm, by definition, exists to make a profit for their shareholders or the owners of the company. It's not to provide services. That's what the government is there to do. So how can we really criticize companies for, not doing what is really not expected of them in the first place? So, I gave you the example yesterday about streetlights, and I said to you that clearly, public goods are a really good example of how you cannot expect a private firm to be involved with that. Okay, and we talked a little bit about the free rider effect. Okay, you should mention that in your answer. Using the term free rider effect, bingo, you're going to get an extra bonus mark just for that. Okay, don't talk to me as if you're my buddy when you're answering economic exam essay questions. Okay, you should be talking like an economist. And you need to use things like the free rider effect. Now, the average guy in the street and your mother and father will never have heard of what the free rider effect is. They don't know. Ask them over breakfast tomorrow morning. Say, hey, Mom, what's the free rider effect? And she's going to have no idea. But you know, and the Cambridge examiner knows. And when you use words like that, the examiner says, whoa, they must be clever. They know the vocabulary of economics. And what happens? You get the examiner into a good frame of mind, and they give you the benefit of the doubt when they're deciding on what mark to give you. Okay? The other one was externalities, okay? And why is it that externalities will create a market failure? In fact, last year, that was the specific question. A specific question. It wasn't even dealing with market failures as a whole. They were just saying, how do externalities affect an economy and provide a market failure? And that's a really good question. Okay, so first of all, in your first paragraph, you need to tell me what a externality is. You need to tell me what positive and negative externalities are. You can give examples. You can give the example that I gave in class about my mother's flowers, if you remember, and then an apiculturalist, a beekeeper. They are people who receive both positive and negative. And then we have the negative, and I think I gave you the example of my brother-in-law who's a pilot for British Airways, and he has an apartment near Heathrow Airport where the apartment is really, really cheap, but it's always shaking because of the airplanes taking off on a minute-by-minute basis. And so I said to you that you can use these examples, but you can try to think of more original examples than that. So certainly when you think about why it is that an externality is creating a market failure, is because you are not ensuring that the true price of the product is passed on to the consumer. Okay? Now, if you're passing it on to somebody else, whether it's the taxpayer or it's the company itself that needs to absorb, that's not considered to be a market success. A consumer should be paying for the total costs of the production, distribution, and exchange of that product or service. So if you're actually somehow subsidizing that product by pushing all the pollution cleanup costs over to the government or to the taxpayer, then clearly you are cheating the system, you're cheating the market, and that would be an example of a market failure. You're actually charging a lower price than should be the case. I mean, I understand why they do it, because they're in a competitive, vicious cycle where they're trying to compete with other countries that don't have any pollution controls, etc., etc. But you have to take that into consideration, okay? And you can put that into your answer. You can sort of say you understand why companies do not pass on the price of the negative externalities over to the consumer, because you believe that the company will lose market share. And say that. Tell the examiner that you understand the companies that are involved with, negative externalities. Now, positive externalities, again, are incorrect, because you haven't really paid my mother for the value of the property because my mother loves to grow lots of flowers in her garden. Okay, remember I said to you that the neighborhood suddenly became a lot more valuable because it was in a neighborhood where this little old lady who had millions of very beautiful flowers in her garden, and this actually succeeded in increasing the value of the property of the whole neighborhood. Well, that's a positive externality. I mean, bees, the buzzing bees, those ones who come to pollinate all your flowers or your crops if you're a farmer, that would be a positive externality as well. So in a true market economy, you should pay the bees, or you should pay my mother for the extra benefit, the extra money that you made because of that, inadvertent or unintentional positive effects on the final price. But they don't do that, obviously, because they don't have to. There's no obligation, there's no legal obligation to pay my mother, and therefore they don't. But that would be considered to be a market failure. So write that down in your essays. The other one is, again, dealing with the problems of information, and that unless you're living in a world that doesn't exist, where information is freely available and that everybody has it, all the consumers, all the producers, they all have the information as to what is available, what is the best choice, who is the best workers, who will accept the lowest salary possible so that I can make an extra profit. Nobody knows that, okay? And therefore, you could argue that although information failure is an example of market failure, it's one of those inevitable, or, it will never disappear. In other words, that type of market failure. So I don't know if we could use that as a criticism of the free market, but you will notice very quickly that this is a problem that is often highlighted by Keynesians when they're trying to hit the monetarists over the head with a big stick, because they are using it to say, hey, you're always criticizing us by being super inefficient, government intervention is no good, blah, 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 blah. And here, look at you, you're actually creating this society where there is no government role to play, and you're making a total mess of our society. We're suddenly we've got lots of negative externalities like pollution, and we've got lots of monopolies. That means that the prices are going really high and the services are going really down, and you don't like that, okay? And for that reason, Keynesians, and this is another example of a question that was brought up in a past A-level paper, is why is it that Keynesians always use market failures as a weapon to hit the monetarists over the head with? Because clearly it reinforces the Keynesian narrative that government is useful, that government is essential for final efficiency, where, all the resources arrive at the right place and that we all benefit and that everybody has a better life and that nobody is left behind. That's what the Keynesians believe in. Keynesians believe in a very inclusive society where everybody benefits from the wealth of the country. Monetarists are not that concerned. Monetarists will say, well, if you got the money, you should have the better services. And if you don't have the money, you don't get the services. I mean, it's like McDonald's. You could have a desire to have a hamburger. You could be hungry, but you're not going to get a hamburger unless you get the money. And this is really what the monetarists are saying to the Keynesians, that they believe that, the role of government should be minimal, because, society operates best when everybody acts in an individualistic, perhaps greedy manner. And if everybody is greedy, then society works more efficiently. Okay? And then finally, we have the failure of the clearing mechanism, and that's an interesting example. That is often used against socialists and Keynesians for having governments that will provide services so that there is always either a shortage or a surplus of that service or good. And the example I think I gave you yesterday were the purple shoes, that if the government decides that everybody has the right to have a new pair of shoes every day, so they produce 10 million purple shoes, then you will find that probably a lot of those shoes will not be used, okay, that they'll be left and not being sold. Or the ones that people really want to have are in short supply, and there's going to be a queue down the street, there's going to be a lineup for the things that people really want to buy, because the government is involved rather than supply and demand and the equilibrium point being the king. Okay? If the equilibrium point is not the king, then you're going to have problems of a failure in the market mechanism. Okay, then finally, really the last topic was the cost-benefit analysis. If you read your textbook really carefully, you're going to notice that the cost-benefit analysis is usually related to big projects. I'm trying to think about examples of cost-benefit analysis. For example, when countries are deciding whether they want to host the Olympic Games, Okay, if I'm not mistaken, Japan are hosting the Olympic Games this summer. Now, when Japan was deciding to host the Olympic Games, they had to sit around in a circle with all the planners and the finance ministry and make a decision as to what are the benefits of hosting the Olympic Games and what are the costs. And can we actually, give an argument in favor of going forward with this project of, making the Olympic Games in 2020. Now, this was back in, I think, 2012. So this has given Japan about 8 years to think about it. So what do? They have like a flip board, and they have a line down the middle, a vertical line, and they have all the good sides and all the bad arguments. And then obviously the good sides would be the tourism that is brought into Japan, the fact that people become more acquainted maybe with Japanese people, with Japanese products, that it would be good for the economy, it would be good for the Olympic Games, it would be good for sports in general, etc., etc., etc. And then on the other side, they're going to say, okay, well, every single Olympic Games for the last 25 years has not made a profit. Okay, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Los Angeles in 1984 was the last Olympics that actually made a profit, and that was basically because the Los Angeles had athletes that had Coca-Cola on their t-shirts, and they had advertising everywhere, which had never been done before because it was considered to be very, very rude or very unacceptable to commercialize the Olympic Games. The Olympic Games was supposed to be something about the beauty of sport and of competition and bringing the world together and promoting world peace and all these kind of good ideas. And the idea of turning it into one big carnival where everybody is selling Olympic ashtrays and t-shirts saying, I was at the Los Angeles Olympic Games in 1984 on a t-shirt, and then selling it for $20, that was considered by some to be excessive, but the organizers were very proud of their achievement because Olympic Games had been making a loss. I know personally because I come from a city called Montreal in Canada, and we had the Olympic Games in 1976. And I was only a little kid at that time, but I knew that this was an outrageous amount of money that the city was spending, Canada and Quebec and Montreal was spending for the Olympic Games, which would take 2 weeks to get through. And then we have all these stadiums and all this facilities that we're never going to use ever again. And for that reason, most people in Montreal thought this was a waste of money. We would have much preferred to have had better schools or better hospitals or a better subway system or anything, but having the Olympic Games, and I may be wrong, but I think that it was something like $2 billion that we had to find. And in those days, in 1976, that was a huge amount of money. And so for that reason, the Olympic Games became a little bit of a liability, we could say, rather than an asset. An asset is something which is really positive for your society, something that you own. Liability is something that you owe. So most countries ended up being hugely in debt, and probably a lot of people regretted having the Olympic Games after they had done it, until Los Angeles. But since Los Angeles, I think every country has always lost money. So read up the chapter, the section on the cost-benefit analysis. There's a couple of little exercises there where it talks about the output, the social benefit, the marginal social benefit, the social cost, and the marginal social cost. And you should be able to work out how they make this question. Because what they might do on the test, they'll say, explain how cost-benefit analysis works in order to help decision makers make a investment decision. Okay, so that's how it's going to be phrased. You know, it's all about investments. You know, when McDonald's decides to invest in putting a restaurant into Hanoi, they're going to make a decision. Okay, they're going to say, okay, well, we've got a certain amount of benefits that we think that this will, you know, develop the name of McDonald's and will make a certain amount of profit. Da, 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 da. On the other hand, you know, it's going to take us maybe 2 years to break even because it's very expensive. The rents in that area of town are very expensive, and most people in Vietnam don't really know much about McDonald's, and most people find McDonald's really expensive. I find it expensive. I'm sure you do as well. And for that reason, you know, there's a lot of disadvantages, a lot of problems introducing something like a Big Mac to Vietnam. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop there and let you reflect on what we have talked about today, and we're going to continue this next class. Bye-bye.